Bum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-da-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum.
Welcome to Everyday Musicality, the podcast in which we discuss all things related to Gordon's music learning theory and how it can help unlock the inner musician that lives inside of all of us. I'm your host, Heather Shouldice, music educator and faculty member for the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. In this episode, we focus on tonal skills learned at the aural-aural level of the skill learning sequence. Hello and welcome to the Everyday Musicality podcast. Today we're continuing the mini-series of episodes focused on the first level of Gordon's skill learning sequence, aural-aural. Before we do, just a reminder that this podcast is sponsored by the Gordon Institute for Music Learning and GIA Publications. GIA is the publisher of both of my new books, my solo book called Weaving It All Together, A Practical Guide to Applying Gordon's Music Learning Theory in the Elementary General Music Program, and the book I co-wrote with Jill Reese and Jennifer Bailey called Q&A for MLT, General Music Perspectives on Music Learning Theory. I'll link to both of those in the show notes in case you're interested. I'll also link to episode number 30, in which I give a run-through of what's in my solo book, and episode 31, in which Jill, Jen, and I chat about our co-authored book. There are a lot of exciting things going on with our other sponsor, the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. They've got their monthly faculty hangout coming up on October 24th with Diane Lang on combining MLT and ORF. They're also trying something new called the Teach a Tune series, in which every month a GIML member will share a video of themselves teaching a tune in a fun tonality or meter and provide opportunities for musicking with that tune. The first one coming up in November will feature the one and only Beth Bolton, whom the most recent edition of the GIML monthly newsletter refers to as the Carole King of GIML. I'll link to that edition of the newsletter so you can check out the latest things going on with GIML. And remember, those opportunities are free for GIML members. I would also like to take a moment to thank our latest patron of the podcast, Dreama Lamb. Thank you, Dreama, for your donation. I really appreciate it. If, like Dreama, you've gotten something out of this podcast and would like to support my work, you can donate at www.patreon.com/everydaymusicality. Now, let's get into today's topic, which continues our mini-series on the aural-aural skill level. If you don't know what I'm talking about when I say aural-aural, I suggest you first listen to episode 9, in which I give an overview of the skill learning sequence, and episode 33, in which I talk about the general gist of the aural-aural skill level. As I discussed in that previous episode, the point of the aural-aural skill level is to begin formal instruction by having students develop their musical listening and performing vocabularies. That's what aural-aural refers to. Aural with an AU refers to listening, and oral with an O refers to performing. Remember, performing doesn't necessarily mean performing for anyone, but just making music, singing, chanting, moving your body to music, or playing instruments. And remember, at the aural-aural level, that singing, chanting, moving, and playing is done without music notation or solfege. Those tools come in at later levels of the skill learning sequence, just like reading, writing, and labeling language come in after a child can already understand and speak the language. So today we're going to look at some tonal skills that can be learned at the aural-aural skill level. These include singing the resting tone on a neutral syllable, echoing tonal patterns on neutral syllables, recognizing familiar tonal patterns within a song, and singing the first or last pitch of a pattern or song on a neutral syllable. And remember, at the aural-aural skill level, we're using neutral syllables. So tonally, oftentimes that means using the syllable bum. Like if we're singing tonal patterns, bum, 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 bum. That's our neutral syllable. It doesn't just have to be bum. That's what Gordon recommended for resting tone or tonal patterns. As I'll demonstrate later in the episode, a neutral syllable could be something like loo, loo, loo. It could be something like do, do. Any syllable that doesn't have any meaning attached to it could be a neutral syllable. So first, singing resting tone on a neutral syllable. Developing a sense of tonal center is so important because it is the basis for tonal context and thus audiation of tonality. The ability to audiate the resting tone or home in a given tonal context provides a person with a tonal anchor against which they can gauge all the other pitches in the tonality. This enables us to have a more accurate sense of intonation. We sing and play more in tune when we are audiating where home is. Audiation of tonal center also provides readiness for harmonic audiation and tonal improvisation. Being able to sense when music moves away from the tonal center and then comes back is necessary in order to improvise tonally and understand harmony. So audiating resting tone is the necessary first step toward achieving those skills. Before expecting students to audiate and perform the resting tone themselves at the aural level, it's helpful to first provide them with opportunities to hear and develop a sense of resting tone. This can be done through activities that emphasize or draw attention to the resting tone in playful ways through informal guidance. I'll link in the show notes to episode 15 in which I shared some practical ideas for informal guidance, including how to expose students to and emphasize the resting tone. Once students have been exposed to the resting tone and have discovered their singing voices through sufficient informal guidance, they should have the readiness to begin learning to perform the resting tone through formal instruction at the aural level. Next, I'll model a process for how you could teach the resting tone at the aural skill level. Bum bum ba-da-da-dum, ya-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum, bum bum ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum, yum ba-da-dum bum, bum, bum bum ba-da-da-dum, bum, ya-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum, bum. Whenever my song stopped, I sang, bum. Give that a try, bum. This time, whenever my song stops, take a breath with me and sing that pitch, bum. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum, bum, 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 ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, bum, bum, ba-dum, ba-da-dum, bum. Yum ba-da-dum bum, bum. So let's talk about that process a little bit. First, I established tonality. That's important because it helps prepare students to audiate the tonal context of the song. In this instance, I sang what's commonly referred to as the sequence of tones. That was the thing that went ya-da-da-da-da-da-dum. Instead, I could have played 1, 5, 1 chords on a piano or a ukulele, but you want to do something that prepares students to audiate the appropriate tonal context of the song. If you didn't do that, the students would have to infer the tonal context for themselves, which isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as you're aware that this would be inference learning. If we were intending to have students generalize at inference learning, we could ask them to find the resting tone or label the tonality of the song, and in that case, we would not establish tonality for them. But at the aural level, remember, students should always be given the answer. They should always have the answer modeled for them before they are expected to provide it. That's why at the aural level, you would be sure to model singing the resting tone for students before you ask them to sing the resting tone. If you simply said to them, sing the resting tone of my song, and didn't model it before you prompted them to respond, they would be forced to make an inference. They would be identifying the resting tone independently. At Aural Aural, students aren't independently identifying. They are recognizing. That's how they learn to independently identify later. So notice when I took you through the process for teaching resting tone a moment ago, I made sure to model singing the resting tone of the song before I asked you to sing it. Make sure that you do the same thing when you're teaching your students at the Aural Aural level. Now, there will be times when you'll want students to independently identify the resting tone, but Aural Aural is not that time. We'll talk about bridging to inference learning from Aural Aural in a future episode. One quick note about labels. Notice when I modeled teaching the resting tone, I just said, whenever I stop, breathe with me and sing that pitch. With my students, I did also start using the label resting tone at the Aural Aural skill level. Technically, that is breaking one of the quote-unquote rules suggested by Gordon. According to Gordon, labels should not be used until the verbal association skill level. So if you're following that guideline strictly, you wouldn't label the resting tone as the resting tone at the Aural Aural level. However, you have to make your own decisions about how you will implement MLT. Personally, I tried to follow Gordon's suggestion to avoid labeling the resting tone at first, but found myself wanting to call it something when giving directions to the students. So I tried following the rule and calling it that special pitch. But that just felt silly, and eventually I decided to just call it resting tone with my students. I was simply using the name resting tone. I wasn't explaining why that pitch was called the resting tone. I wasn't explaining it was the first pitch of the scale or anything like that, so I considered my use of the term resting tone to be a reasonable compromise for my own teaching practice that didn't defy the spirit of Aural Aural learning, because I wasn't explaining the label. If this is interesting to you, I'll link in the show notes to an article that I wrote for the Musicality, which is the journal that comes out every year from the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. I wrote an article called Evading the MLT Police, all about breaking the so-called rules of MLT. The Musicality is one of your benefits of being a member of the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. You get the new quarterly e-bulletin 4 times a year, and then also the Musicality. Now, going back to resting tone, one thing that I wasn't able to model for you in the format of a podcast would be the gesture that would accompany the breath when prompting students to sing the resting tone. After singing part of the song, I would pause briefly and then show a clear gesture with my hands by holding them out in front of myself and moving them with a slight upward movement while modeling the breath before singing. Also notice I paused very slightly before that breath and gesture. The pause and breath are important for encouraging audiation and breathing before singing for students. That's what Gordon would call the audiation breath. So that was the basic way of starting to teach the resting tone. Initially, you could teach resting tone in a learning sequence activity, in which case it would be in response to a tonal pattern instead of a whole song. And you would also move on to individual assessment by having students sing the resting tone in solo. There are also many more playful ways in which you can reinforce and practice audiating and singing resting tone in classroom activities. Here's where I would like to try something new on this podcast. I want to try a listener idea or listener suggestion episode. So if you have a favorite way that you like to teach or reinforce resting tone, maybe a fun activity or a prop that you like to use, please send me a brief description in an email or a voice memo, and I'll share your idea in an upcoming episode, giving you credit, of course. Next, let's look at another tonal skill that's practiced at the Aural Aural skill level, which is echoing tonal patterns on neutral syllables. Back in episode 8, I talked about the basics of pattern instruction, so I'll link to that in the show notes. Basically, the skill of singing tonal patterns is important because it helps students develop a tonal content vocabulary. Just as young children build a vocabulary of words to use in communicating, a vocabulary of tonal patterns serves as the musical building blocks to help students learn to audiate tonally and communicate their own musical thoughts. Then they can connect their tonal pattern vocabulary to the repertoire they're learning, which is part of the whole part whole learning process in music learning theory. I talked about that whole part whole learning process back in episode 5, which I'll link to in the show notes. So teaching tonal patterns can be pretty simple, like this. Ya-da-da-da-da-da-dum. Be my echo. Bum bum. Bum bum bum. Bum 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 bum. Bum bum bum. Bum bum bum. Bum bum. Bum bum. So, just like with teaching resting tone, I started by establishing tonality and noticed that it was on neutral syllables because we're at the aural skill level. Ya-da-da-da-da-da-dum. Later on, when we moved to the verbal association level, we could add tonal solfege to that sequence of tones. Mi, fa, mi, re, do, ti, si, la. But remember, we don't use solfege yet at the aural skill level. We first just want students to have an opportunity to be immersed in the musical sounds and to begin audiating and performing them without solfege or labels attached. So after I established tonality, I simply asked you to echo, and I performed short tonal patterns in the given tonality. These tonal patterns were arpeggiations of tonic and dominant chords, and each pattern included 2, 3, or 4 pitches. If you included any more than 4, the pattern gets difficult to remember. If you include less than 2, an individual pitch has no meaning by itself. It's by experiencing the relationship with at least one other pitch in the given context that we audiate the pattern and give it tonal meaning. Notice that just like with resting tone, there's a slight pause before prompting students to sing, and then you would model that clear breath with a gesture to indicate to students to breathe and echo the pattern. There are learning sequence activity pages designed to focus on the skill of echoing tonal patterns, and after teaching some group patterns, you can move on to inviting students to echo tonal patterns in solo. Once students have experienced echoing tonal patterns in learning sequence activities, there are a lot of ways in which the skill of singing tonal patterns on neutral syllables can be practiced in classroom activities. One simple way is simply to sing patterns for students to echo in between repetitions of a song. Additionally, classroom activities can incorporate props or games to engage students and encourage singing of tonal patterns. Again, I want to plan that future episode of listener suggestions, so please send me your favorite activity ideas for getting students to echo tonal patterns, and I would love to feature your suggestion in a future episode. In addition to echoing tonal patterns on neutral syllables, another important tonal skill to develop at the aural level is recognizing where tonal patterns happen within songs. Again, this is an important component of the final whole within the whole part whole learning process, in which students apply their audiation skills and pattern vocabulary to their performance and understanding of repertoire. To teach the skill of aurally recognizing a familiar tonal pattern within a song, you might do something like this. Ya-da-da-da-da-da-dum. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum. Be my echo. Bum, bum. That pattern, bum, bum, happens somewhere in my song. Sing that pattern again. Bum, bum. Now listen to my song again and see if you can find that pattern. Bum, bum. What was the pattern again? Bum, bum. Find it in my song. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum. Bum, bum. What was the pattern I asked you to find? Bum, bum. Did you find that pattern? Bum, bum, in the song? Here's the answer. I'll sing the song and I'll make that pattern bum, bum, just a little bit louder than the other parts of the song. Here I go. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-da-dum. Bum, bum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, Now that pattern, bum, bum, might have sounded a little bit different in the song because it had a different rhythm. Bum, bum. But it was still the same pitches of bum, bum. So that was that pattern. Notice that in that process, I didn't ask you to tell me where the pattern happened in the song independently. I did ask you to listen for the pattern, but I made sure to tell you what the answer was. If you wanted to have your students generalize and find the pattern independently, then you could ask the students to tell you where the pattern happens. But since we're at aural, I made sure to tell you the answer. Now, it was a bit hard to demonstrate that activity through audio only. If we were actually in a room together, I wouldn't show you where that pattern happened by singing it loudly like that. I didn't think that was a very musical performance of that song, but such is the limits of having audio only and no visual. If we were doing that activity in a classroom together, I would typically use some kind of movement or a gesture to show students where the pattern happens. For example, I might raise my hand whenever the pattern occurs in the song, or perform some kind of movement like wiggling my fingers or tapping on the pattern. Then you could ask the students to recognize where the pattern happens by doing that same movement or raising their hands whenever the pattern happens in the song. Another idea for recognizing where tonal patterns happen would be to have students chime in on the pattern whenever it happens as you sing the song. You could also have students move a prop whenever the pattern happens in the song. Maybe you move scarves with flow during the song, but make a wide arc over your head whenever that tonal pattern occurs. Or if we were doing the song I've been using in this episode that's called Minor Swing, that's in my book, maybe we take our scarves and we pulse them in the air on the pattern, bum, bum, and then we continue moving with flow for the rest of the song. Once students are familiar with the pattern and where it happens in the song, you could also invite individual students to sing it in solo whenever it occurs in the song. For example, I might use the frog song from Jump Right In Book 1. Let's see if I can remember it. Loo 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 loo. Here's a pattern that happens in the song, Lulu. So I might show students where the pattern Lulu happens in the song, Lulu, and so on. And remember, Lu counts as a neutral syllable because it doesn't have musical meaning attached to it like solfege does. Then we could add lyrics to the song, and I would invite the students to sing that pattern on Ga-gung, because it goes, Ga-gung went the little green frog one day, Ga-gung went the little green frog, and so on. So students would start by chiming in on Ga-gung, and I would fill in the other parts. Next, I found some cute little frog finger puppets, and I would pass out the puppets to 3 individual students, gesturing for each one of those 3 students to sing the ga-gung pattern in solo while moving their frog finger puppet from low to high. And then the rest of the class would sing the other parts of the song once they knew how it goes. Finally, one more tonal skill that could be learned at the aural level is singing the first or last pitch of a pattern or song on a neutral syllable. By vocalizing only this one pitch, students are encouraged to internalize the other pitches. Gordon considered this skill so important in preventing imitation that he made it the first tonal learning sequence activity page, T1A1. In classroom activities, the teacher could model singing the first or last pitch of a song on a neutral syllable and invite students to sing that pitch, explaining that it sounds the same as the first or last pitch sung in the song. This could be reinforced by inviting students to sing only that pitch and silently audiating the remainder of the song while moving. Additionally, the teacher might call attention to whether the first or last pitch sounds the same as the resting tone. Now, let's talk for a quick minute about that first learning sequence activity page, T1A1. Every MLT practitioner I know has expressed frustration at how difficult that first tonal LSA can be, myself included. In fact, I know some teachers who skip that page, T1A1, altogether, and they jump right to T1A3, in which students are echoing tonal patterns. However, it is important to realize why Gordon started with having students sing only the first pitch of each pattern, and that is to encourage audiation rather than just imitation. Jumping right to echoing tonal patterns may seem easier and make us feel more successful, but audiation is much more valuable in the long run than imitation. So although T1A1 can be really hard for students at first, I think it's important to encourage tonal audiation by starting with that page. When I was teaching kids, I made a few little tweaks to that page to help students be more successful. First, I would start with a few group patterns in which I would ask students to silently audiate the whole pattern after I sang it. So I would sing the pattern, gesture to them, and breathe, and they would breathe and sing it in their heads. Some like to tap their foreheads or their temples as they would think it in their heads. Also, I would actually start by modeling that task first and asking the students to figure out what their job is today. I would lean to one side to show my job, the teacher's job, and then lean to the other side to show the student's job. So I would lean to one side and point to myself as I sang a pattern, and then I would lean to the other side while pointing to the students, and I would silently bob my head or tap my forehead as I thought each pitch in my head. This got the students actively engaged and also gave them a better understanding of what to do. So after the kids figured it out and silently audiated some patterns back to me, I would invite them to figure out what their next job was as I modeled singing the pattern and leaning to one side, and then singing just the first pitch and pretending to silently audiate the remaining pitches as I leaned to the other side. So I would sing the first pitch of the pattern and then silently tap my head to show that I was thinking the remaining pitches in my head. Modeling the task, leading students to realize what the task was, and encouraging them to continue audiating the remaining pitches in each pattern typically led to more accuracy in singing the first pitch than simply telling them, sing only the first pitch. Now, it was still challenging for my students, I'm not going to lie, but it was a lot smoother. And then every time we came back to that skill in subsequent learning sequence activity pages, they would get better and better at it. So those are the main tonal skills practiced and reinforced at the aural-oral skill level: singing the resting tone on a neutral syllable, echoing tonal patterns on neutral syllables, recognizing familiar tonal patterns in a song, and singing the first or last pitch of a pattern or song on a neutral syllable. I should also mention that these skills are also combined with content. So you might start with tonic and dominant functions in major and minor tonality at the aural-oral level, but then later you would decide how and when to add in other tonal content at the aural-oral level. For example, once you've moved tonic and dominant in major and minor along to the verbal association or partial synthesis level, you might decide to start teaching subdominant in major and minor at the aural-oral level. Or you might choose to start teaching tonic and subtonic in mixolydian tonality at the aural-oral level. Remember, we always start at the aural-oral level with every new kind of content that we're introducing. The point is that when you're teaching at a particular skill level of the skill learning sequence, you're always combining that skill level with content. So you get to decide how you're going to sequence content and how you're going to move that content through the skill learning sequence at various times. In the next episode, I'm going to cover the rhythmic skills taught and learned at the aural-oral skill level, and then in the episode after that, I'll be talking about bridging to levels of inference learning from the aural-oral skill level. And then after that, I would love to do that listener suggestion episode, so please don't forget to send me your favorite strategy for teaching resting tone or for getting your students to echo tonal patterns. Maybe it's a fun pattern echoing game or a prop that your students love that gets them excited to sing in solo or that provides a great visual or kinesthetic reinforcement of the resting tone. Whatever it is, we would love to hear about it. Just send a description to me via email at everydaymusicality@gmail.com, or you could record a short voice memo of yourself describing the activity and email me that voice memo. I'm sure listeners would love to hear other teachers describe in their own words what they have found success with. So please send me your emails or voice memos with your favorite activities or ideas for teaching resting tone or echoing tonal patterns at the aural-oral skill level. In the meantime, if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please get in touch. You can email me or send me a voice memo at everydaymusicality@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and let's keep musicking every day.